In this week's episode of Gangsta, the S-Minutes have arrived in town and a massacre has begun. So much going on in this week's episode. What was really surprising about this week's episode of Gangsta is that Warwick and Nicholas were not a part of the main story at all. This episode completely demonstrated that Gangster can stand alone because of its side characters, which are just as interesting as the mains. This week's episode was just a big, badass action anime massacre. The S-Minutes coming into town, fighting against the Twilights, and literally storming the Palkley Guild was one of the highlights of the entire series. Not only that, but there was a major character death in this week's episode, and this is still all just a big build-up to Warwick and Nicholas actually getting involved in this conflict. Let's talk about the S-Minutes for a second, because in this week's episode, we finally get some names for these characters and we get to learn a little bit more about them. The two members of S-Minutes, who I believe to be the higher-ups, or probably the seniors of the group, are Stryker and Beretta. Stryker was a character who appeared in last week's episode. He was that one silver-haired guy that Warwick ran into that he didn't recognize. He didn't really do too much in this week's episode, aside from having an ominously badass presence, but he was still really intimidating while he was just walking through alleys and just completely beating the living shit out of people. And then, of course, we have Beretta. This is a character who is very beautiful, but she's also a little bit insane. And she also seems to have the ability to smell things really well. I'm not sure what's up with that, but because of this, she actually ends up finding out that Connie is in a relationship with Marco, and Marco seems to have had a relationship with both Beretta and Stryker in the past, which eventually turned violent. This could be possibly how he got that big scar on his face and lost a chunk of his ear, or maybe something even worse happened. Maybe he actually worked with these guys before, because the thing about S-Minutes is these guys are regular humans, and Marco himself is also like sort of like a superhuman badass, so maybe this is who he received his training from. All I know is I'm really intrigued to see where that story is going. Not to be outdone in the crazy department, there's also the duo of Sig and Colt. Sig is the one female member of the group with the ponytail, the eye patch, and the giant frickin' axe. In this week's episode, she makes great use of that weapon by massacring countless Twilights, invading the Palkley Guild, and there's this one scene that was probably my favorite, where she took out this one big guy and didn't have access to her axe, but she did have a knife in her hand, and there was this one sniper who was a couple buildings over, and she just looks up for a second and throws the knife right at him, taking him out instantly. This is a chick with an eye patch who probably has a lot of problems with depth perception. She's just a normal human, and she just knifed a Twilight from afar. The frickin' S-Minutes are not to be messed with. Case in point, Colt. This guy's really mysterious, and I don't really know anything about him, aside from the fact that he's just this really crazy dude who loves to use black knives in battle, and he uses them in a really crucial scene in this week's episode when he straight up kills Doug. That's right. Doug dies in this week's episode, and I honestly did not see that coming whatsoever. I thought he was going to live out a little bit longer, and I thought he may have been able to survive that big attack he got hit with, where basically Colt just jumped down right in front of him and cut this huge X right across his chest. But throughout most of the episode, he's just walking through the city, bleeding out, trying to find some help. And eventually, he does run into Galahad, and that's where he says his final words to him. And all Doug really wanted to know about really what was going on with the Palkley Guild and what was going on in the city. Galahad even thanks him for working with him, and that's the end of Doug. Holy crap. But let's talk about the real stars of this week's episode. There's, of course, the leader of the Palkley Guild, and there's Ginger. Now, I always knew that these two were really close together, but apparently they are in a relationship, which is pretty freaking awesome. But again, Ginger just demonstrates how freaking awesome she is. There's a scene where Colt is trying to attack both her and the Palkley leader, and she ends up just snapping his knife with her feet. Her feet! These guys are freaking awesome. In terms of the most badass characters in the series, I have got to give it to the Palkley leader and freaking Ginger. They are an amazing duo. Not only that, but they are so freaking badass, they actually manage to make both Sig and Colt leave. Although they did get a little bit of help from the character of Emilio Benedetto. Yes, You remember him, the brother of Alex? He actually does appear in this week's episode, mostly off-screen, causing a lot of explosions and creating all of this smoke, which is going to make it really difficult for all of the Twilights, but even better for the hunters who are trying to track them down. Emilio seems like he's basically just the explosions expert, but until we see him in battle, I really don't know what to say about his character. Speaking of the Benedettos, we also have Alex, who starts to get her memories back of her brother when she's holding that baby, so that's going to be really important. But really, this week's episode was just a big, action-packed, ridiculous fun fest. So what's the rundown on this week's episode of Gangsta? The thing that interests me the most about this week's episode is the story that's going on with Marco, Stryker, and Beretta. I want to know what's going on with these guys, because despite the fact that they're not like the Twilights, the devil fruit users of the series, they still seem to be just as interesting. I especially love how they gave us a little bit of a flashback showing Stryker and Beretta with, I'm guessing, Marco, and everything's covered in blood. I just don't know what's going on, and I really want to know what the deal is. There's also even more little revelations. Like, I never realized that one character who was working for Moreau, his name is Yang, was actually that one small kid we saw in last week's episode in the flashback, the one who Nicholas ran into, and he's the one who actually had a very close relationship with Delico and Erica. And where the hell is Erica? When are these characters going to appear? There's so much mysteriousness behind this week's episode, but it won't bother you that much because there's so much action going on at the same time that this episode is just really going to entrance you. And the Esminettes themselves, they're just insane. They're just really crazy people who seem like they really love to do what they do, which is just to kill people left and right. In particular, Sig and Colt. They are just completely insane. And then, of course, there's Emilio, who, like I said, we just don't really know anything about him, but I know he's going to be really important. And also something that I'm not sure if it's a mistake or not from the Esminettes is when they're actually talking to the Palkly leader, Colt actually says that they're working for Uranus Corsica, the leader of the Corsicans. I don't know if that was something he should have said, or maybe, you know, the leader of the Corsicans is just like, you know, screw it! I'm calling out war on everybody, and this is what's gonna go down. I want his family dead! I want his dog dead! I want his house burnt to the ground! I want to go there in the middle of the night and I want to piss on the ashes! That's some good mafioso anime magic. What I will say is, this episode was awesome. A lot of crazy things went down. There were some cool revelations, some brand new mysteries, and like I said, this week's episode didn't even really involve the main characters of the series. It was completely built upon the strength of its side characters, which shows that the world of Gangster is just as interesting as the main story of it. All I know is, great episode right here. Pretty good animation and artwork, fun action scenes, and lots of just amazing moments. So, I like this one. Probably my second favorite episode of Gangster, maybe my favorite. It's really hard to tell, but I can't wait to see where the series is going and how they're going to conclude everything, because this is based on an ongoing manga series, so I don't know if they're going to come up with their very own ending, if they're going to split the seasons in two. I'm really interested to see how they're going to wrap things up, but still, great episode right here. 5 out of 5 from me. Check it out, Gangster fans. Whether you're reading the manga or watching the anime, check out this week's episode. You might see something you like. Thank you guys for watching my review. Make sure to like it and share it with your friends. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. That way you can see all of our latest anime and manga reviews and our weekly podcast show, The Powerful Nerdcast. Thank you guys again for watching, and as always, stay dandy, baby.